What is up, everyone? Today is July 21st, 2023. I cannot believe how quick the summer is going by. It's kind of crazy. Today, we have another special guest, Bennett, one of my close buddies from the Chart Guys. Also, somebody who was brave enough to go skydiving and convince me to go skydiving a year or so ago. Bennett, what's up? Maybe you can give a little introduction to yourself, and then we'll dive into it.
Yo, what's going on, Julian? Thanks for having me on. It's good to be on. Good to be chatting about some Bitcoin and things that are going to be going on in the world geopolitically. Just quick story about me. I'm just a guy who went full-time trader about a year and a half ago. Have a background in social work and economics, and found myself just drawn to the markets and Bitcoin since 2017 and crypto. But I think Julian has had a little bit of influence on me because I've gone more towards the path of Bitcoin maximalist over the
Yeah.
past year and a half, from being just all about the crypto ecosystem just 2, 3 years ago. So here I
Yeah,
am.
my little earworms finally got to you. Speaking of which, quick plug from our sponsor here. If you're in Canada and you're looking to buy Bitcoin either for the first time or you just want it to regularly show up in your wallet, Beaver Bitcoin is the best way to make that happen. This week's show is brought to you by Beaver Bitcoin. Dollar cost averaging is the most stress-free method to enter the Bitcoin space. And if you're looking for a simplified way of buying Bitcoin in Canada without needing to rely on a custodial exchange, Beaver Bitcoin is your best bet. Beaver Bitcoin lets you set up recurring Bitcoin purchases directly from your Canadian bank account and straight into a Bitcoin address that you control. It's like a savings account in a currency that you actually want, or a Netflix subscription that doesn't suck. And if you don't want to wait to stack sats, Beaver Bitcoin supports instant non-custodial Bitcoin buying via e-transfer as well. Give it a shot today at beaverbitcoin.com. Awesome. Okay, so first thing, you are a trader, and that means that you probably have some opinions on some of the charts. And I don't normally get super in depth with the charts this week, but last week we talked a little bit about how there was a bit of a rebalancing with some of the tech names, and it looks like some of that happened this week. You know, Nvidia pulled down a little bit. We'll pull up a couple of these. But just looking at the triple Qs this week, it's the first week in a while that it was down. I don't know. It looks there are a couple down weeks in the middle of these up weeks, but first I would say major week of consolidation in about 4 or 5 months. How
Yeah.
did you find anything interesting happen this week?
I was a little frustrated because I missed some shorts on NASDAQ. I'm trading mostly futures right now, but I mean the NQ futures coincide with the QQQ. And I was hesitant to short because of just the strength we were seeing in the Dow and the S&P 500. And I think it was overdue. So we'll see if next week we can form higher lows, or we EQ out, or perhaps go to a lower low. But this rebalancing is interesting because we've had these major names like Nvidia and Apple kind of pulling the market for so long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what I'm prepared for is I'm prepared for all the doomers to come out and say, this is your big lower high, and pull out the 2008 chart. So this is the lower high before we go down to 100 on the triple Qs or whatever. When this could, we don't know how this is going to play out, but this could just be healthy daily or weekly consolidation for the indexes before they move up higher. But yeah, it's been a while that we've just been trending and grinding upwards against everyone's expectations. The NASDAQ this year, I think, is up 38%, which is pretty wild. That's 3 years worth of average gains in about 6 months. Mind you, the year before was pretty rough, but yeah, interesting times. And then Bitcoin, Bitcoin itself, not doing a whole lot.
Just a
One of the
quick
fascinating,
comment about the QQQ being up so much is I notice a lot of people connected to the markets still don't feel like their portfolio has recovered the 38% you just mentioned, because
yeah.
it's really from those big names. Like all the
Mhm.
Kathy Wood stocks and all those biotech stocks, they're still nowhere near the prices they were at when we had the COVID boom in 2021.
Yeah, and most of the biggest names in the triple Qs are past their all-time highs. So Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft,
Hmm.
um, the ones that are behind, I think, are Tesla, Facebook,
And
and
Apple.
Google. No, I think Apple made a new all-time high.
It had the split. so it's hard
Right.
to actually
And there's
tell
the
if I,
dividend component, but
yeah.
I think it's like it looks pretty. It was 183 or 182 was the past all time high, so still remarkably strong. And so it was almost like if you just bought the biggest names, you almost did better than buying the
Hmm.
index, which has actually been par for the course for the last like 10 or 15 years. If you just bought the top seven versus buying the index as a whole, you outperformed and you got similar, ups and downs basically. Um, but yeah, I mean, enough about that. Bitcoin is the thing that we like to focus on this
Yeah.
show. It's been chopping around, but I have been very surprised by the volatility in some of these mining names. And there's a bit of fundamental news behind that. It looked like Fidelity and a couple of these institutions have loaded up on shares of Riot and Mara. But even if you look at some of the smaller names, they've also done, anywhere between 30 to 200% moves in the last 4 weeks, while Bitcoin has chopped around and basically, given us nothing.
Hmm.
What do you think about that? Do you think that means like a Bitcoin move is imminent or
Hmm.
what?
Well, I too, my best trade or investment of this year has been MicroStrategy. I pretty much bought the bottom and I'm up over 150%. So
Yeah,
that's really nice. I
yeah.
think you actually posted on Twitter recently that it could be that a lot of these institutions still can't buy Bitcoin. So they're going the route of these other investment vehicles. I know, for instance, I mentioned to you, my father's in finance. He manages money for people
Mhm.
and he's not allowed to buy Bitcoin still. So his clients are stuck to GBTC or some of these other mining companies.
And we'll get into that in a sec because GBTC has some important stuff coming up on the horizon. But first things first, small story. I don't know, Bennett, if you've used the Lightning Network before. Have you?
I think to donate to one of your things, but
Oh
that's
yeah,
it.
let's go.
It gave you
um,
some stats.
This actually, I found out like a second ago, wasn't a new story. One of the news aggregators I follow posted it, and I was like, oh, that's cool. Turned out this was like a year ago. But the Federal Reserve actually did a study on the Lightning Network and came to some cool realizations of it. Nothing that we don't know as Bitcoiners, but they talked about how Lightning could help Bitcoin move, obviously on the second layer at a much faster speed without costing a lot of fees. They talked about how that can offset a lot of people's concerns with mining and the increased energy usage, even though there isn't like a total link there. But some of the cool things about Lightning that like a lot of people who aren't super into Bitcoin might not know about is that the Lightning Network in of itself is really developing, where else the core Bitcoin protocol is kind of ossified in probably a good way to keep that hard money layer sacrosanct. The Lightning Network is integrating all these new things. Like one of the newest features now, I think as of last year or 2 years ago, is Bolt. It's called Bolt 11 or Bolt 12. And what it essentially allows you to do is to make a invoice that as soon as somebody interacts with it, they can just withdraw from that address. And that might not seem like that novel, but generally whenever you want to send Bitcoin to someone, you as the sender have to like consent at that time of transmitting in order to do it. But now you can almost create these little piggy banks that someone can just tap and they can just pull the funds out of, sort of like a
Hmm.
coin faucet, which is cool. And I made a little video on Twitter a while ago, where basically one of the cool functions of this is that you can take a NFC compatible card or a ring or a sticker, and then you can tap it against a cell phone with one of the Bitcoin wallets, and you can instantly give people Bitcoin, almost like cash. So you could get one of these like QR devices; they maybe cost 25 cents, and then instead of saying like, "Hey, download a Bitcoin wallet, do all this," you can just say, download a Bitcoin wallet when you get home. Here's 10,000 Sats. Don't lose the card, and they can instantly redeem it, which is kind of neat. And it's all something that's basically open source. So
Hmm.
that's one of the cool innovations with Lightning. Another thing is that if you start diving into more of the custodial services, so the maybe not so open source things, some of these wallets now have functions like stable sats, which allow you to hedge Bitcoin that you have in your own custody without actually having to be on an exchange. So stable sats is in one of these wallets called Blink, and Blink lets you send Bitcoin over Lightning, receive Bitcoin over Lightning, run it as like a point of service or point of sale app. But then you can take some of that Bitcoin and you can convert it into faux USD without actually buying stable coins or anything like that. What essentially happens is you're going short on futures, and then you get the equivalent short position on futures backed by the Bitcoin in your wallet. So you essentially get like a synthetic US dollar. So I don't know, some cool things in there,
Yeah.
innovations using the Lightning Network. Just thought I would be worth mentioning.
Seems to be propelling the use case to a more open playing field so anyone can get into it a lot easier.
Exactly. And that's been the thing is like Bitcoin has that UX and UI problem inherently, and it's the designers of these wallets, and there are trade-offs, of course. You put these things into not exactly self-custody sometimes, but making Bitcoin usable, I think, is that has become a real big theme, I think, since the 21 top. And I've really noticed it as I've traveled around, is like Bitcoin is way more usable than it was 2 years ago, just for everyday transactions. So yeah, big win for us. Celebrate it.
Yeah.
All right. If you're watching the show, feel free to chime in and comment if you have any thoughts on things. I'll bring up the comments on stream so we can kind of keep it a bit more interactive. The next thing we're going to talk about is these Bitcoin ETFs. And so we've been chatting about it for a while, but I followed this guy named Scott Johnson, and he brought up some really interesting points about the ETF process. So if you've been following, when are we going to get a spot Bitcoin ETF? And you've tried to figure out why hasn't one been approved already, it's basically because the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is stonewalling the approval of this because they don't feel that the markets are adequately surveilled. So they think that, Coinbase or Kraken or wherever people trade Bitcoin, those prices are not maybe real, or, there's some funny business there. And they're worried that if they approve a Bitcoin product, which uses those exchanges, those spot exchanges as a reference, that there could be some funny business and manipulation. And that is the reason for the last 7, I think actually 10 years, the Winklevi twins have been applying for a Bitcoin spot ETF for 10 years at this point. They have been rejected every single year over essentially this statute that the SEC keeps citing, which is saying you need a surveillance sharing agreement. These exchanges need to give us all their information and their data. They need to come to the SEC. Even though the exchanges have come out and said, we've tried, there's just no framework for it, and you guys don't pick up the phone. Now, where this gets interesting is this SSA thing, the surveillance sharing agreement that the SEC says that they want in order to approve a Bitcoin ETF. Turns out that when the first gold ETFs were launched, there was no surveillance sharing agreement, yet the SEC approved those in the underlying spot market. So they're applying this pretty rigorous double standard, I would say, to approving this Bitcoin ETF. And maybe there's some ulterior motives behind that. Who knows? But this year, obviously, with BlackRock and all of these other big institutions, Fidelity, pushing for these spot ETFs, it feels like something behind the scenes has changed, at least in their confidence to keep pushing forward with it. And all of these applications, they all reference Coinbase as kind of the exchange that they're going to use to reference what the accurate Bitcoin price is. And at the same time, Coinbase is caught up in this big lawsuit with the SEC over the listing of some of their other tokens and not being a registered broker. So yeah, there's all these moving parts to it that are kind of interesting. And you would think that, from an eagle's eye view, if it wasn't BlackRock, you would just say, these are just going to be rejected, right? Like all these ETFs are going to be rejected. It looks like nothing has changed really fundamentally here. And the SEC just has every, right or excuse they can normally use to shut these down. At the same time, a giant institution like BlackRock would not apply for these things if they thought that was going to be the inevitable outcome. They're seeing something different here, even though these ETF applications are not quite too different from the ones of the past. And so that's why this dynamic and everybody kind of waiting for what's next is sort of interesting. But I posited this question. I'll stop my yapping for a second here to the audience. How useful is a Bitcoin ETF to you? Because like Bennett was saying, if you're running, a financial, fund or you're running a fund for someone or an investment portfolio, you're not allowed to just go out and buy spot Bitcoin and then just keep it in custody. That's not, really allowed. There has to be a QSIP number attached to it, something that is in a federal register that identifies what the asset is. And Bitcoin in its spot format doesn't have it. So there is a use case for these Bitcoin ETFs, which is essentially to take the Bitcoin product and securitize it like everything else in the world. But I asked the people, there's another reason to have a Bitcoin ETF, which is essentially that you get tax advantages with it. Because right now, when you buy and sell Bitcoin, you're paying 30% or more capital gains depending on where you are based on the profit of it. But if you're doing that with an ETF, you wouldn't have necessarily those issues if you had it in a 401k or a tax-free savings account. So Bennett, from your perspective, because you are someone who holds spot real Bitcoin, I assume, but you have family that's in the financial industry. When one of these products gets approved, and they will inevitably get improved, would you change the structure of how you hold your Bitcoin? Would you be more likely to say, I'm going to get rid of my spot and then, load up on the Bitcoin ETF? Or would you kind of keep it the same?
My whole premise is I like holding actual Bitcoin, but at the same time, there are, as you said, tax advantages and benefits to having it held by custodial brokers. And for instance, in one account for a long period of time, I was using MicroStrategy stock as part of my assets to help me trade on margin because it was part of the pool of money I had in the brokerage account. So it made more sense in that case to have my Bitcoin in the form of some type of stock. That being said, if a Bitcoin ETF gets approved, I probably would just transition some of these miners or MicroStrategy or GBTC into a spot Bitcoin ETF in my IRA or in other investment vehicles that are with actual brokerage companies, and also hold actual Bitcoin on a hardware wallet stored away somewhere safe.
That's interesting. So if you had a spot Bitcoin ETF approved, you feel like you would be less likely to hold these like ancillary products like the miners or MicroStrategy?
Probably.
You think that's like a consensus view? Because I think that's one of the things that's baffled me over the last few weeks is like how much those companies have run up relative to Bitcoin doing nothing. And it almost feels like a little ridiculous. Like if you look at them, if you look at Riot and Mara denominated in Bitcoin, not US dollars, they're at like their peaks right now. So you think that if a Bitcoin ETF got approved, that the premium on some of these products would come down?
I honestly don't know, but I know they're great for trading. So I'd
Yeah.
probably go for trading and using technical analysis to just get in and out an intraday or a couple days trade. And for my actual investments, I would migrate any holdings I had in investments in miners and or MicroStrategy or GBTC probably to the spot Bitcoin ETF.
Because for me, what I'm trying to figure out, because it's baffled me how much Riot and Mara and these names have run up while Bitcoin's just been flat. To me, what it looks like is it's trying to chase or front run a inevitable Bitcoin trade. And I think when that shows up in the form of an ETF approval, then the money will flow out. And so for me, I'm trying to figure out, is this run up people really wanting these businesses, these like mining businesses or MicroStrategy, or is it people trying to flip for a short-term trade? I mean, we can't know. We only have price action. But to me, the extension of some of these names relative to Bitcoin shows, to me, some attempt to front run a ETF approval. I don't know.
I don't know either, but that sounds like a astute observation that probably has some truth to it.
Plausible, maybe.
Yes, plausible.
A little thing here, because I always like to give people something to look forward to. We don't know when all these ETFs are going to be approved, but they've all technically entered the Federal Register. And so what that means is that the SEC has put them on notice. They're reviewing the applications, even though they pretty much look the same as the old ones. But one of the things that people haven't really talked about is that Grayscale and the SEC, who have been kind of embroiled in this court battle over the SEC rejecting their application for a Bitcoin fund, they are going to have a decision made probably in the next 30 days. So to catch people up, for those who don't know, Grayscale is suing the SEC because they did not allow them to convert their Bitcoin fund, of which it is pretty massive. It holds about, I think, 3 or 4% of all the Bitcoin in all of existence. They wanted to convert it into some sort of ETF or ETP. And SEC said, no, not happening, even though it's been trading on the OTC brokerages. And so they have now pressed the SEC. Both sides have submitted all their stuff to court. And there's supposed to be a decision in mid-August. And it's sort of like the Ripple thing from last week, where you kind of don't know when the hammer is going to drop. It's going to drop probably in a range. But in terms of Bitcoin catalyst, as we look at the Bitcoin price coiling up, I would say that is the next important catalyst to watch out for is what the DC Circuit Court says. What party is in the right here to move ahead with or not move ahead with their ETP? Because potentially, if the court actually sides with Grayscale, we could have a Bitcoin ETF possibly by September. I think that would be the case if they rejected the SEC's argument against Grayscale. They would have to kind of de facto approve or work with them to approve a Bitcoin ETF under their name. So yeah, something interesting to watch out for on that angle.
I'm curious to ask you, like, as a Canadian, have you invested in any of the Canadian traded Bitcoin ETFs?
No, I haven't. Actually, no, I have one. I have one in my RRSP. It's almost like a
That's
joke because it's so irrelevant compared to my normal, my regular Bitcoin stack. But I have a bit of one, and then I have some MicroStrategy. But yeah, like to your point, like there are Bitcoin ETFs that exist, but people want an American one, right?
Also, I can't invest as an American in any of the Canadian ones, even on international interactive brokers or
Yeah.
other brokerage companies that let me trade international stocks. The Canadian ETFs are off limits.
Yeah. Yeah, completely. I think there's a Fidelity Bitcoin ETF in Canada that is denominated in US dollars. So maybe that could be off limits still because it's OTC, but there is like a Bitcoin ETF that is in US dollars. But yeah, it might be listed on the TSX or something. Matifia says, I do think the majority of traders that take positions in those stocks mar riot to have exposure to Bitcoin without having access to a spot BTC ETF. So yeah, I think a lot of people are using these things and however volatile they are to essentially get exposure to the asset. And so what's interesting is they've sort of taken off a life of their own. I don't think I've ever seen them so disconnected from the Bitcoin price. But to me, I can't imagine that disconnection lasting too much longer. I know a lot of people, when we trade, we're watching like, what is the Bitcoin doing on the 5-minute chart? Maybe that can tell me what the miners are going to do. But it's like, it's so futile because Bitcoin has been in this like 2% range for the last, 2 weeks, it seems. All right. Next story. El Salvador's bonds are outperforming. And so this is something that the mainstream media has just been burying for the longest time. They were so ecstatic to call El Salvador's Bitcoin experiment a failure. And a lot of economists were coming out saying this is going to tank El Salvador, even though it was like a small investment for them. El Salvador is going to ruin themselves by getting into Bitcoin. It turns out, as Bukele has turned the country around, as they've created a lot more jobs and as they've completely overhauled their tax collection process, that they are going out and they're actually paying their debts. And what was once trading at, I think, about 27 cents on the dollar. Is that correct here? Yeah.
I wouldn't be
2025
surprised.
bonds in El Salvador were trading on 27 cents on the dollar, which means that bond traders thought there was a 73% chance that El Salvador would default in 2025. That has flipped now to 89 cents. And frankly, it'll probably be 100 cents on the dollar fairly soon because in the last year or two, El Salvador has actually just begun to buy back their own bonds. You can just wipe the debt that you owe if you're able to buy back your debt commitments at pennies on the dollar. So I think that is so interesting. You're not seeing that in any other Latin American country.
Nope.
I don't know, Bennett. What do you think about this?
I am humbly impressed by everything El Salvador is doing, and from my friends in Mexico and Guatemala, the neighboring countries, they go to El Salvador and are envious of the changes they're witnessing firsthand. And I traveled actually when I was in Guatemala earlier this year with a Salvadorian girl. And she said the younger generation pretty much across the board is totally supportive of him. And they're aware of what's going on with Bitcoin and in favor of it. And they see it as a future option for Salvador to kind of spread its own wings and actually emerge from its historical just economic complacency. It's the older generation that's still struggling to get on board. But even that's changing, and eventually they'll continue to grow old and the newer generation will take over.
And I think something that's interesting, I don't have a chart for it, but El Salvador actually has the one of the lowest median ages for population in almost any country. So like the median age in El Salvador is like mid-20s. So there's a lot of young people there. And so they must be really ecstatic that, the country is really turning around and opportunities are opening up. And, you can go to El Salvador and start a company that works in technology and have 0% taxes across the board. So zero payroll, zero cap gains, zero corporate tax. I think they have like a value added tax there or something like that. Zero property tax apparently too. And you just have to say, it's a Salvadoran company. We're hiring Salvadorans, and we're gonna keep the headquarters here. And so a company like Strike they announced that they were moving their headquarters down there because of that, right? Why wouldn't you? That's where all the talent is. So yeah, Maticha also says how El Salvador has eradicated criminal gangs is also really impressive. I'm curious what you think of that, because I know that some people are on the fence about how he's handled it in terms of, I guess, how humane it is. Like they've taken videos of, tens of thousands of, prisoners and, kind of lining them up like cattle and moving them around. And they've built some mega prisons there, but I don't know, how else would you handle it really?
I don't know how else you'd handle it. And then as a US citizen, I have no ability to point my finger at the way another country handles their prison population, because after all, the United States has the largest prison population in the world. It's a business here, a very lucrative business. So anytime I see US media demonize the way El Salvador goes about it, I just say it's kind of contradicting what we do here.
Pot calling the kettle black, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And from my friends in Guatemala who go to El Salvador and feel safer than they do in their own country and Mexico, I think the actual reality speaks differently. The people are content and happy with the way things are evolving.
Yeah, Guatemala, I tried to dive a little bit into their politics when I was making my my video down there, and they, maybe I would say now second to El Salvador, have some of the most stable Latin American, I guess, politics. Like their dollar's doing pretty well compared to like Honduras, Nicaragua, I guess.
Honduras is another story, but from my recent musings on Guatemala, it seems like the recent presidential election, I'm not too up to speed on it, but all the contender politicians were pretty much eliminated for a variety of reasons that the government in power called nefarious actions. And there's some shady things going on behind the scenes there too. But we don't point our finger at Guatemala's US media doesn't, because it's run by 5 or 6 families that are in bed with the United States and very well connected to the United States. And they're technically an ally in the region. Honduras is another story altogether, because they're the black sheep of all of Latin America right now, along with Venezuela.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I had a really positive experience when I went to Guatemala. It seems like they, very similar to El Salvador, have been embracing Bitcoin. But the political structure is very different. They don't have a Bukele, a populist, in there yet that is very pro-freedom. So who knows?
I know. I think they're looking for one, though. Let's hope they find one.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to let you run with this topic after I tee it up. It's all about American politics.
All right.
So RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has been getting so much spotlight recently. He testified in front of Congress. I would say, trying to be objective, I think he's probably the most well-spoken politician in the field. I feel like he's very honest. He's sincere. I don't agree with all his positions. But he's been getting a lot of steam. He's been showing up on more of these podcasts and alternative media, because the mainstream media likes to call him a conspiracy theorist and totally censor him in every which way possible. But one of the things that some people might not know is that he's a huge supporter of Bitcoin. And some of the he spoke at the Bitcoin conference in Miami, had this big keynote there. But he came out with a Bitcoin policy platform this week, saying that he wants to back treasury assets with real dollars. So for all the debt that the U.S. issues, he wants to have some percent of it in Bitcoin. He said around 1% of all T-bills. And I don't know the total amount, but if there's, call it $40 trillion of U.S. debt, if that is all in T-bills somewhere, that would imply $400 billion of Bitcoin to back it in today's dollars. So that's interesting. He also wants to treat Bitcoin like a currency, which I'm a huge proponent of. I don't like this idea. I really don't like, and I did it for a while, calling Bitcoin digital gold, because I think it's so much more than that. You cannot use gold as money. You have to use another layer on top of it, and it just doesn't work. It's not fungible. But Bitcoin, I think, is money. I think it can be a currency in of its own right. And I think that countries like El Salvador made the right move treating it like one, where you don't have capital gains and you can just denominate things in Bitcoin. So he's looking to treat it like that from a tax perspective and a classification perspective. And then also he wants to do like ancillary things, which I think are really important. Right now, a lot of states are treating Bitcoin miners as these separate entities under the law that are not using electricity correctly or consuming too much of it. And so it's the same thing in Canada. They're trying to ban Bitcoin miners from actually setting up shops, saying that, crypto miners not allowed to use electricity. They use it wrong. And it just comes from a complete place of misunderstanding. And he's looking to essentially pass bills that don't allow people to discriminate on electrical usage for certain appliances. So I think that's good. The question is like, does this guy have a chance? And then zooming out bigger picture, like, what is the situation going on in 2024? Bennett, I'd love to hear your opinion on a guy like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and then where you see things, I guess, in July 2023 moving into the election next year.
Sadly, I've become very jaded in my mid to upper 30s now with U.S. politics and these outsider candidates within the political parties that I would love to see have a legitimate chance. And this is after supporting such candidates on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, from Ron Paul and Kasich on the Republican side to Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard on the Democratic side. So, like, I do not associate with either party. I like people trying to really shake things up. And I view Kennedy in the same line. He's stuck in an even more difficult spot because he's a Kennedy, so he has no option but to run as a Democrat, because that's where the Kennedys hang their hat and coat. And when I hear about him in mainstream media right now, it's only demonizing him, that he's a Democrat in name only, and he's really shilling Republican talking points. So that puts him at an instant disadvantage to the mass who vote Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And I sadly don't think he has a chance, but I'd support him, and I like his policies and, I don't know, platform. Unfortunately, you have to toe the party line.
And he's running against like an incumbent, like he's running in Democratic primaries, with the president being the other person he's running against, like that. I think it was Robert F. Kennedy, his father. That's one of the only times in history where alternative candidate has upset the incumbent president in the same party. I could be wrong on that, because I think Robert F. Kennedy upset Lyndon B. Johnson, right, when he was running.
I don't know about that. Just not up to date.
But that was how unpopular Lyndon B. Johnson was at the time. I think that his father had a chance, and then unfortunately was assassinated. But yeah, I mean, I'm on the same road with you, where I think he has really important things to say, and it kind of begs the question. I like to think about this. I think everyone runs for president because they hope to win. Deep down inside, we don't actually know how much they feel about their actual odds. You run anyways. You run, to either, keep your party in the limelight or to get a certain position out into the public. And I kind of wonder, what is the point of running?
If I'm just going to think,
is it to pump his numbers or to prep for a future run down the road?
If I'm going to think just out loud right now, I think there's no option except to run Biden against Trump in this upcoming election. I don't think any other candidates on either party have a chance, but he's getting his name out there, and it could be for the following election.
And then
Bitcoin will be an even more bigger force in the world. Maybe we'll have those ETFs approved. We'll be using it for trade internationally. And people will remember this is the guy who did run and say we should have been doing this 3 or 4 years ago.
Well, what's really stunned me is that you have RFK Jr., who has put out a very, I haven't really gone into it too much in this article. He's put out a very comprehensive position and stance on Bitcoin. He's talking about running a node giving people the right to possess it, running, miners, all these things, like really detailed positions that, his base thus far probably has no clue about. Like he has like a sect of Bitcoiners that seem to like him, but I mean, he's talking to everyone out there. And so when he uses words like nodes and hard currencies and stuff like that, like people have no idea what he's talking about.
No.
But he spent a lot of time bringing it up. And then you look across the other side of the aisle, you have Ron DeSantis, who has made it like a staple of his platform, no CBDCs. I can't say the guy's last name, Vivek Ramaswamy, another Republican candidate, saying that, we're going to bring Bitcoin into the Federal Reserve and on the balance sheet as well, and also do very similar things to Kennedy. I didn't think this fast and this, I would say, relatively, like small into Bitcoin's adoption would you start seeing so many presidential candidates speaking about it. Now, the problem is they're all long shots right now. But in Canada, we have our own guy named Pierre Poilievre. He's the head of the Conservative Party. He looks like a lock to be the next prime minister of Canada at this point. Like Trudeau has really dropped the ball up here. So unless there's some sort of election manipulation, I don't see a future where the Conservatives and him do not end up becoming the leaders of our country in the next 2 years. And he has come out and he has praised Bitcoin and he's talked about, enabling rights for it, probably from a more insincere light. I think he's just using it to rally some voters rather than, him looking at it as something to, actually embrace. But I mean, the fact that in the last 2 years, all through Bitcoin's price declining, so many politicians have come out to talk about it and embrace it is interesting to me, because all these people, they all have speechwriters and policy advisors. And, you have to be careful with how you spend your time and energy. And clearly, all of these candidates are seeing enough benefit and a big enough block in Bitcoiners to appeal to them and to spend the time to build these policy positions out. So, yeah, I find that pretty interesting.
Well, the writing's on the wall, and down the line, they're going to be remembered when people look them up in the next election as the ones who actually did mention Bitcoin and being ahead of the curve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's like, right now, Bitcoin's not in the mainstream consciousness because the price isn't at all-time highs and your favorite celebrities aren't talking about it. But, I think it matters to a lot of people. Like there's 12% of Americans apparently own a type of cryptocurrency or have some exposure to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that number of 12% of Americans is split across party lines in one direction or another. I think it's like a pretty even split. Of that 12%, 6 of them are probably Democratic or independent or Republican and independent. So it's kind of baffling that like this administration in particular in the US has been so hard against Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and is really trying to like shut down that innovation in the country as much as possible. Because if the price of Bitcoin rises anytime between now and the election, it just takes a second to look at all of the negative press and push that the Democrats have had against bringing Bitcoin jobs and innovation into the country. And if that becomes a big part of your net worth, even if you're a Democrat, it's hard to vote for a party that is against your own financial interest, I would think.
Agreed.
All right. This last story is kind of interesting to me. If you haven't seen it, I did a video with a trucker. We traveled across Eastern Canada for 2 days. But we had some interesting conversations about the trucking industry. And I know that the chart guys, they're in the chat. Go Bennett. The chart guys had a member within them that runs FreightWaves, which is a company involved in trucking logistics and futures and things like that. And it came out 2 days ago. One of the largest trucking carriers in the country, Yellow, is teetering on the verge of bankruptcy now. And part of it is because they didn't put towards the Teamsters Union a pension disbursement that they were supposed to of about $50 million. You're supposed to always contribute a set amount or some sort of amount towards pension goals, and they decided not to. And the Teamsters Union now, which is the largest union of truckers in the U.S., has said is that if they don't pay, they're going to strike on Monday. But it looks to me like the writing's on the wall for this Yellow company. And apparently, this trucking and freight company, Yellow, represents about 9% of capacity in the US for less than truckloads freighting. And so, what less than truckloads freighting means is there's some stuff that doesn't constitute a full one of these freights here that can carry like 80,000 kilograms. It's for smaller loads between 150 to 100 or 15K pounds. They employ 22,000 truckers, and they have about 43,000 trailers. And so this could be going out of business as soon as next week. And I usually wouldn't pay attention to a story like this. Like I think a year or two, like 90% odds that no one cares about what happened to this company. But I also look at a story like this and think that these are always the types of signals that we see before a recession. And this recession that everyone's been talking about for the last 2 years and will keep talking about for the next 2 years, the recession that never seems to come, the one that the stock market keeps grinding up against, everyone's waiting for the ball to drop. Interest rates, commercial real estate, regional banks, trucking industry. Like, what is going to be the shoe to drop? And I think trucking is maybe the one to spend a little bit of energy looking at in the next few weeks, because you have this company that represents 9% of a pretty significant industry in the US going belly up, 22,000 jobs lost. These are very blue collar jobs. And then you also have trucking rejection rates, which kind of represent like how much capacity the trucking industry has at lows, which essentially means that all freights are being picked up and moved. There's plenty of truckers on the road, maybe too many. It's like their version of the, unemployment or overemployment rate. And despite, I think, this year being like the largest year ever for Amazon Prime Day, which it seems every year is, it seems that the consumer is weakening. In August, we have, the camera just froze my face here. Give me a second. This always happens at the most opportune times. There we go. What I was saying is you have all these factors like student loans coming back online for a lot of students in October, average one being $400 a month. All these little signals that the consumer might be weakening a little bit. And the trucking industry, I know a lot of people look at FedEx's numbers and UPS's numbers as sort of these early signals for a recession. And, a bankruptcy like this can also be the start of a chain reaction similar to SVB and the downfall of some of the other regional banks tied to it. So I don't know. Is this just more recession porn to think about and then not think about 10 minutes from now? Or do you think that this could be a signal to something a little bit worse in the future?
I like that term, recession porn.
People really like it, man. Like, go to YouTube, and it's like every thumbnail is like, the recession just started and the Fed didn't tell you. It's like, it's fear. Fear just sells, right?
Well, you said it with the bank failures that was supposed to be the shoe that was dropping, that was going to lead to a cascade. I would be inclined to say this is more recession porn at the moment. I'd be more concerned when those student loans come due and people have to start upping their payments. And eventually when the housing market starts to turn around, because the housing market, despite interest rates going up as much as they have, is still strong in most places. And people who have flexible mortgages where they're not fixed are going to be in pain. If you want to move and get a new house, it's going to slow things down a lot. But right now I'm sticking to trading the charts and holding fundamental investments that I think have quality that will survive. And I'm more in the camp, and we've talked about this, of stagflation. We're not going to have a super hard recession and we're not going to have a super big boom. We're just going to teeter sideways, and there'll be certain sectors that do well, certain sectors that don't do well. And it's not going to be the typical past where it's recession, boom, or bust. We're just going to go sideways.
I am such an anti-stagflation guy, and I'll tell you why. Because every single time something remotely deflationary has threatened an industry, take the banks, for example, that is deflationary because of the potential bankruptcies there. the Fed and the government have just kicked into full gear with the money printer and just
Mm,
added, fire to all of that. On the other hand, I do understand the standpoint of like there could be stagflation because you have AI, reducing costs for consumers and producers and all these things, and that is a very deflationary force. But in my opinion, like AI takes a lot of innovation to actually start working its way into the system and to start, reducing the cost of goods. But governments are increasingly in these debt spirals that keep on compounding larger and larger and larger, tons of pensions. And you can't have, the costs of things going down because that is pulling down GDP and tax receipts, and also pay all the billions and billions of dollars, trillions in liabilities that are only going to keep coming up every single year, like all the pensions, for the boomers that are going to be coming up and need to be paid. And the debt now, the statistic I just heard is that the U.S. now pays more in interest expenses annually than they pay on the military. That
mm.
hasn't happened in a pretty long time. The U.S. likes to spend a lot on the military, so for them to be putting their money essentially just paying out to the creditors of the U.S., that's not very savory. And so I don't know. Let's play this out. Like, if you think we're going to go into a stagflationary environment, do you think that will coexist similar to the zero interest rate policies that we've had in the past? Like the Fed will do everything to stimulate, but they can't, similar to Japan? Or how do you what environment? Like, how do you see the rates in the macro picture in a stagflationary environment?
I see the rates coming down a little bit first and foremost, and then just teetering up and down. And I don't think it's going to be stagflation across the board. I think we're going to have certain sectors that continue in their inflationary upward track, other sectors that we start to see prices come down. And
Hmm.
a lot of it's still going to have to do with supply chains around the world and just in general with how all governments around the world start to react with their interest rate pricings.
So what do you see as like the most deflationary sectors?
Hmm. I mean, kind of contradicting what you said, where technology and AI start to take over and level
Yeah.
out prices. I think that housing will eventually start to come down. It can't go up forever, and that's a huge sector, at least in the US. Uh, and I don't see the supply chain situation getting better anytime soon, so I think we're still gonna eventually see prices continue on the upward track of like international trade goods and commodities.
I think one of the things that surprised me, because you always look to hard commodities if you're looking for signs of inflation. Hard commodities have come down tremendously. Like, I think I was reading that wheat is now the same price as it was like 15, 20 years ago.
Hmm.
Um, oil,
Oil, natural gas.
natural gas, man,
It's insane the amount it's come
that
down.
is whipped back down ferociously. And I remember I
Copper's
was like,
back down.
yeah,
Copper inventories are on the decline in Shanghai right now.
yeah. I think a big part of it too is like China, they're so interconnected with the rest of the economy, and they look to be probably sooner going into a recession,
Yeah.
just based on like the demographic problems they're having there, and a lot of emigration going on. But
Well, just take that. Like we're looking at this from a Western perspective, but if China goes into recession and stops feeding global commodity demand and stops being a new source of consumption, that decreases demand. And demand goes down, prices eventually have to go down to try to stimulate people to buy things and use services.
mhm.
I don't think it's a one size fits all, and I don't know what the actual answer is. I'm just going to trade the charts and
Yeah,
adapt as the days come.
yeah, it's you can pontificate on these things all day long, but what really matters is like, I guess, where you put your money on it and all that.
Mm,
To me, I still see the macro picture, at least in the US, of the debt burden is not going away anytime soon. And, you know, productivity just keeps going down. So you got to pay to get people to work at this point, I think, in the US sometimes. So I just find stagflation hard there,
mm.
but who knows? All right, last thread, and this will be me. Are you a big movie guy? Do you go out to
No,
theaters a lot? No.
I go out to the movies once in a while, but I have an issue watching depressing movies these days. I don't like things that
That's
depress me.
that's fair. That's fair.
Make me
What about like TV shows?
not too much either. I
No?
watch anime and some shows when I go to the gym just to get through cardio sessions, but I'm not big on TV shows. A couple with my partner, like funny shows, Parks and Rec, or I don't know,
I love Parks and Rec.
those mindless comedy shows that make me laugh.
Yeah. So, this is just like a me thing that I'm interested in. I always like sending you the notes. You're just like, honestly, like I don't give an F about this stuff. But I'm so interested in it because I mean you've probably seen the meme Barbie and Oppenheimer coming out in the same weekend.
Yes, I've heard
Barbenheimer,
about the movie. Yeah.
the big double feature of the decade, which is cool. Like as a person who loves movies, like I'm always stoked, when something catches fire and brings people in the theaters. Like the last thing I want to see personally is movie theaters get shut down. I go like twice or three times a month to movies. Um, Follow makiko.tv. My girlfriend does movie reviews with me after we see them in 60 seconds. But the big story that's been going on in the movie industry is that there is this writer strike that's been going on for a while, because the streaming services, they don't pay residuals. So once you produce something for them, you don't get residual checks coming in every year or whatever based on viewership or anything like that, like the old model of doing things, right? Old model, you made a TV show like Seinfeld, you'd be getting residuals forever as a writer, till the end of time. It was a great income source because as somebody working in the film industry, you can go on these dry spells and not have any work. And residuals have kind of kept actors and writers and everyone in the film industry afloat during some of the harder periods in the industry, because the industry is always changing. And so now that the streaming companies have so much power in dictating the future, and that they are the biggest spenders. They're taking these billions of dollars from shareholders and from their raises and just from their extra cash, Apple, Netflix, Amazon. They're putting it into these movies. They have all the say. And so now you're seeing Hollywood strike against that because they're starting to push it a little too far. They want to, pay people one-off fees to have their voice and their facial rights so that they can start making AI versions of them in the show so they don't have to hire them for pickups, maybe even voice acting altogether. And the unions hate that, right? Because it's just less work for them and more profit and, cheaper talent for the big production studios. And so I thought a lot about this over the last week because I don't know about you, you probably haven't like caught up on all the Marvel movies.
Marvel's the exception. I'm a
Marvel's
long
exception.
time X-Men and Marvel fan,
So
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 I do
so it's
watch
been
all those movies.
but like the new ones kind of suck though, right?
Not the biggest fan of them compared to the old ones,
Like that
and
new
they
Ant-Man
dropped.
movie.
I did not see that one, but they
There you
dropped the
go.
ball in the most recent X-Men movie, and now they're bringing back Wolverine and Deadpool to do something together.
Yeah, how could they bring back Wolverine after Logan? That was such like a good send off and
I
all of
don't know,
that.
man.
But anyways, paychecks, right? Point is like we just saw Indiana Jones 5, Harrison Ford, right? Big tentpole franchise, get upended by a movie called The Sound of Freedom, which is like an indie film that was $15 million to produce. That actually was in development hell. They finished filming and editing it 5 years ago, and they couldn't find a distributor for it. And they crowdfunded the distribution of it. And in its opening weekend or the second weekend, it actually did more in the box office in the US than Indiana Jones, a film that cost Disney $300 million that they might not even break even on in the end now. And so Disney, they went on this wave of acquisitions in the last few years. They bought Marvel, Star Wars, Lucasfilm, all that stuff. All those franchises are basically at dead ends right now. Like there's, no new Star Wars film in sight. Everyone hated the last one. The Marvel stuff's really starting to teeter off. Like they've had a lot of bombs lately, not making back, their budgets. And then Indiana Jones. No one cares to see Harrison Ford when he's like, 80 something, throwing around a CGI whip. And so I think a lot about how, there's this strike going on and how all of these streaming companies are not, wanting to come to the table with actors and writers, and how typical Hollywood studios like Disney or Universal are also running into the same problems where they can't get the writers and the actors on the same page too, because they're just pushing these IP products to make films out of. And it just seems like the market's getting tired of it. And where I see opportunity and where I see like a light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully a reason to get Bennett out to more movie theaters, is that you got this film. Have you heard of it, The Sound of Freedom?
Interestingly enough, I heard about The Sound of Freedom and I had not heard about Indiana Jones until my partner's cousin asked if we wanted to go see it with them. And
There
that's
you go.
because I'm more active on Twitter and the internet than I
Mhm.
am in watching TV and commercials where I guess I'd see previews to Indiana Jones.
So this Sound of Freedom movie, which like minimal advertising budget, has such an interesting story. So they wrote it and they shot it in like 2018, and then the pandemic came, and basically they were going to distribute it under Fox. The movie, by the way, it's about child trafficking, and this real life story of a guy going in and doing this pretty amazing operation to rescue a couple children. Um, so they make this movie in 2018, 2019. Fox was going to distribute it. Disney buys Fox. Then they decide we don't want to distribute this film anymore. They can't find a distributor for it because it's a very touchy subject. They couldn't figure out like how are we going to market this to make back its budget. Nobody wanted to do it. They take this film to another company called Angel Studios. And Angel Studios, it's been known to be this like, right wing, very Christian oriented film production studio. But put that aside, what's more interesting about Angel Studios is that it's not just like a couple people running a fund. It's a completely crowd-funded platform. So you can take your film or your cartoon or TV show or anything to Angel Studios and use it like a Kickstarter platform to raise money for distribution, finishing funds, whatever. And so they go to Angel Studios. They finally raise enough money. They raised another 15 million, I think, from 7,000 individual investors. So I think all in all, the expense for this film, marketing and budget was maybe about 25 million. Film makes $40 million in its opening weekend and is now made over $100 million in the US alone on a $15 million budget, which is incredible. And a big part of that is, a small spoiler, when you get to the end of the film, there's sort of this message from the actor straight to camera talking about the realities of child trafficking, but it's like a call to action that says like, if you thought this movie was good or important, you can scan this QR code and buy a ticket for the next person, because we think the best way to get the messaging of what is going on with child trafficking is to get people to come and see movies, right? Because movies connect with people more than maybe an article or a documentary might. And I think just on that alone, that little call to action, I think has, to me, ushered in potentially a revolution in the film industry, in that now you can go out, make a $15 million fiction film, not fiction because it is based on a real story, but it's a script with dialogue that didn't necessarily happen. You can crowdfund this, and you can make $100 million in the box office, and you don't need a superhero. You don't need to have massive Tom Cruise jumping off like mountain action scenes. You can just make something that connects with people, whether it's a drama or a comedy. You can get the crowdfunding for it, and you could potentially make back all your money and then some for your next film. And I think that is something really positive that has developed in the last few weeks, in light of all this stuff going on in Hollywood and all the shutdowns. But yeah, I just like to bring that out to people. Go see that movie if you haven't. You might not think it's the best movie ever made. It doesn't feel like a cheap indie film, but it doesn't feel like made by Disney or anything like that. But it has a really important message, and it's very well acted. And it's pretty thrilling at parts too. But it's interesting. I think we have this big week of like Barbie and Oppenheimer coming out. These two big, I would say Barbie is the IP one, and then Oppenheimer, I almost call Christopher Nolan like an IP, because you kind of go out to see the new Christopher Nolan film when they come out every like 3 or 4 years. But it's nice to see that there is room for other types of filmmaking out there that can survive in cinemas, that people will leave the couch to go watch. So yeah, that's about it.
I'd equate this to, as a gamer, there are indie games that are returning better bang for your buck in terms of the investors and people who kickstart them than the mainstream titles are. I mean, Final Fantasy 16 just came out and is doing great right now commercially, but Final Fantasy 15 was a flop and lost money, despite it costing and being so much money was invested in. There were indie games that return better returns for the investors that were crowd-funded.
Man, the indie game scene is really interesting because I've seen these like random games on Steam, and
Yeah.
some video game YouTuber like Dunkey will do like a playthrough, and these things will get millions of downloads at $10 a pop, right? So that's something where like films are it almost feels like a bit of a commitment. Like if someone I know recommends a film, well, Sound of Freedom, for example, like Mel Gibson put out this like Instagram thing on it, and I think that's part of the reason it did so well at the box office. It's still an effort to go out and see a movie in theaters, but when you see like a YouTuber playing a video game and they are having like a ball at it or whatever, and it's like $5 or $10 on the Steam store, you just buy it and you try it out
Mm-hmm.
right away. So yeah, it's the same thing with indie games. Like you don't necessarily need to have these like massive budgets to succeed, right? So yeah, a little bit of that charm coming into filmmaking, hopefully. So yeah, all right, that's it. Any lasting thoughts on any of the stories we covered this week?
I am enthralled by El Salvador, and Latin America is my calling. I love traveling Latin America, so I really hope to get down there and check it out for myself in person.
November, there's a Bitcoin conference down there.
Hmm.
Come 7th to 9th.
And you can pay in Bitcoin, I assume.
You can buy almost anything you want in Bitcoin down there. Yeah.
Okay, so let's hope that Bitcoin goes up in price a bit more so I could buy the trip using my Bitcoin.
Yeah.
On the cheap.
Or you don't want it to go back in price, up in price, because if you buy your ticket today and it goes up in price, then you'll feel like you overpaid. But...
Yeah. Well, I'll wait till like September. Hopefully that ETF gets approved and then.
There we go.
Yeah.
That'll be your ETF approval gift to yourself.
There you go.
There.
Right on.
Cool, man. Well, it's great having you on. Where can people find you?
I run a nonprofit, Kipu Life, KIPULIFE, and I also have a website, Kipu Trader, where I post my trading videos on and off, and I'm trying to get it all into a bigger thing called the Kipu Collective. You can find me, start with Kipu Trader or KipuLife.com.
Cool. Sorry, we got one last question. I'm going to pass it to you here from the audience. Matitya asked, do you have a take on the upcoming BRICS gold-backed currency?
I think it's way overhyped. The US dollar still reigns supreme. And I'm actually very shocked by all the musings coming out of Lula in Brazil that he's kind of gone so strongly towards wanting to create this BRICS currency, but I think it's all hype right now. And it's not a legitimate plan. The US dollar will remain supreme. And Brazil, anyone watching this should look up positive swap line nations, which are nations that are entitled to instantly access US dollars straight from the US. Brazil's one of them. They are not going to give that up, hell or high water, to create their own BRICS currency.
Yeah, Marin Katusa, that book you recommended me where he breaks down the importance of swap lines. I think that's like drastically underestimated by the people who think that, you can just create another gold-backed currency. Yeah. You need that like the economy needs lubrication, and that's essentially what the swap lines provide. Is that instant convertibility, and I don't think that the U.S. is going to be so on board to do that. That's just reopening the gold window essentially, right? So, yeah, that'd be a good episode to kind of like dive into that a little bit more, because it's tricky to kind of figure out, what the ultimate plan is. But I don't think the plan for BRICS is. I don't think the end game for them is a currency. I think it's just that as a trading block will become more significant, and they'll use whatever medium works for them. If the US dollar becomes more politicized, there's urgency. But I think there was a bit of, nervousness with, the US shutting down SWIFT for Russia. But I mean, that conflict's now going on a year and a half. Nothing has really devolved there in terms of like making the US dollar any less neutral.
Yeah.
So as long as
you also have to think currency is one of the most powerful things a nation has behind it. And you're talking about countries that don't even get along that well with each other. Russia and China have issues amongst each other. China and India have issues amongst each other. And you want these countries to coordinate on a unified currency? That's asking quite a lot.
Yeah, I agree. It is a lot to give up your own currency issuance and not have that much potential upside. I totally agree on that. All right, we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much, Bennett.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me, man.
We'll catch everyone up next week. Take care.
Right on. Cheers. Adios.
Peace.